The fence row crackled with the kind of late spring heat that promised a good planting season. I was leaning on a cedar post, my hand calloused and stained from the creosote, listening to the familiar, rhythmic clank of the post-hole digger on the back of my old Farmall M. It was a sound as steady as my own heartbeat, a sound my father had listened to, and his father before him. The M, a 1949 model, wasn't much to look at. Her red paint was faded to a dull, sun-bleached orange, and a spiderweb of cracks ran across the rear tire, but she started on the second crank every time, and she didn't owe a single man on this earth a damn dime. That's when I heard the other sound, a high-pitched, hydraulic whine, followed by the deep, guttural rumble of a brand-new diesel engine. It was a sound that didn't belong in our quiet corner of Boone County. I squinted against the sun, looking across the barbed wire that separated my land from Dale Peterson's. A flatbed truck from the John Deere dealership in town was just pulling away, leaving behind a monument of gleaming green and yellow steel on Dale's headland. It was a 44 Forte, so new the tires still had the little rubber hairs on them. The cab, a space-age bubble of tinted glass they called a sound guard body, towered over the field. Dale saw me watching. He hopped down from the cab, a grin plastered across his face, the kind of grin a man gets when he's just signed his name on a piece of paper for more money than his grandfather ever saw in his lifetime. He was 10 years younger than me, full of piss and vinegar, and convinced that the old ways of farming were a one-way ticket to the poorhouse. He strode over to the fence line, his new boots sinking into the soft dirt. "Well, what do you think, Frank?" he shouted, gesturing back at the tractor like he'd built it himself. 130 horses at the drawbar. Got the quad-range transmission, air conditioning, even a radio. No more sweating my tail off in July, I'll tell you that. I gave a slow nod, pulling a worn leather glove off my hand. "She's a big one, Dale. Must have set you back a pretty penny." He laughed, a sharp, confident sound. "You got to spend money to make money, Frank. That's what the banker told me. Said I was a progressive farmer. Said the government wants us planting fence-a-row to fence-a-row, and you can't do that with ancient iron." He glanced over at my little Farmall M, then at the bigger, but still 20-year-old, International 1096 I used for the heavy tillage. A look of pity crossed his face. "You know," he said, leaning on the fence post opposite me, his voice dropping into a confidential, man-to-man tone. "You ought to head down to the dealer. Seriously. They're practically giving these things away. The bank's handing out money like candy right now. Trade that old smoke belcher in," he nodded toward my 1066, "and get yourself a real tractor. You could probably double the acres you plant in a day." I looked from his earnest, slightly smug face to the massive green machine behind him. I could smell the fresh paint from 50 yards away. It smelled like debt. It smelled like a monthly payment that was more than my entire operating loan for the year. I thought about my 1066. She wasn't pretty. The red paint was peeling off the hood, and the seat cushion was ripped, stuffed with a piece of old foam I'd salvaged. But I knew every inch of her. I knew the specific groan the TA made when it was about to shift, the way the engine coughed twice before roaring to life on a cold morning. I'd rebuilt the engine myself 2 winters ago in my shop, honing the cylinders by hand, torquing the head bolts in the precise sequence the manual demanded. That tractor and I had an understanding. She was paid for. Every nut, every bolt, every drop of oil in her was mine. "I appreciate the advice, Dale," I said, pulling my glove back on. "But the 1066 and we get along just fine. She's paid for. I like the feeling of that." Dale shook his head, a little smirk playing on his lips. "Paid for doesn't buy you more land, Frank. paid for doesn't get the crop in before the rain comes. You're living in the past. This is 1978. Farming's a business now, not a hobby." He slapped the fence post with finality. "Well, don't say I didn't warn you when you're out here wrenching in the mud while I'm sitting in my air-conditioned cab listening to the ball game." He turned and walked back to his new tractor, climbing the steps with a spring in his step. The engine roared to life, a smooth, powerful sound that made the ground vibrate. He put it in gear, and the massive machine pulled away, its dual rear wheels barely leaving a track in the soil. I watched him go, a green giant rolling across a field of black dirt, a symbol of the future. I turned back to my old M. I grabbed the crank, gave it a sharp pull, and the little four-cylinder engine coughed, sputtered, and settled into its familiar, off-beat idle. Pop, 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 pop. It was the sound of self-reliance, the sound of freedom. Dale thought I was a fool, stuck in the past. Maybe he was right. But as I watched him disappear over the rise, I couldn't shake the feeling that his brand-new, debt-fueled future was built on a foundation of sand. Before we go any further, I have to ask you folks listening, have you ever had a neighbor, a friend, or even a family member give you advice that sounded good on the surface, but your gut told you it was dead wrong? Let me know down in the comments what that was, and if you listened to your gut or to them. It's a crossroads we all face, and Frank Miller was standing right in the middle of it, that spring afternoon, with the smell of new paint on one side of the fence and the smell of old, honest grease on the other. The spring planting season of 78 came and went. Dale, in his new 44-440, got his corn in the ground in 3 days flat. He'd pull his 12-row planter until dusk, the lights on his cab glowing like a spaceship in the twilight. It took me a full week with my old 6-row International planter hitched to the 1066. Every morning, I'd be up before the sun, greasing the zerks, checking the oil, listening to the engine for any sound that was out of place. Dale would wave from his climate-controlled cab as he lapped me, a look on his face that was a mixture of pity and superiority. The talk at the grain elevator and the feed store in town was all about Dale Peterson and his new machine. "That boy's going places," Old Man Harris would say. "He understands you gotta modernize." When my name came up, they'd just shake their heads. "Frank's a good man, but stubborn as a mule. He's gonna get left behind, trying to farm like his daddy did." I ignored them. I knew my costs. I knew my land. My father had taught me that a farmer fights 3 wars every year. One against the weather, one against the market, and one against the bank. He said the first 2 were acts of God, but the third one was a battle of your own making, and the only one you could be sure to win by simply refusing to fight. The real test came that fall, right in the middle of the soybean harvest. The weather had been perfect, a long stretch of dry, sunny days that had the beans rattling in their pods, just begging to be cut. I was out on my old Gleaner E combine, a machine that was already considered an antique by most. It wasn't big, it wasn't fast, but it was simple. I could fix nearly anything on it with a set of wrenches and a pry bar. I was about halfway through a 100-acre field, the dust flying, the familiar hum of the machine a comfort, when I heard it. It wasn't a loud bang or a catastrophic crunch. It was a subtle change in pitch, a high-pitched whine that slowly grew into a grinding groan from the guts of the machine. I knew that sound. It was the sound of a main bearing letting go. I immediately shut down the header, killed the separator, and let the engine idle down. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of the dry soybean stalks. I climbed down from the cab, my heart sinking into my boots. The forecast was calling for a week of rain starting in 2 days. 50 acres of soybeans, my main cash crop for the year, were sitting in the field, vulnerable. I spent the rest of the afternoon taking things apart. I laid a dusty tarp on the ground and started pulling off the main drive belts, then the heavy cast-iron pulley. By the time the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I had the bearing housing exposed. It was just as I'd feared. The outer race of the main thresher bearing had disintegrated, sending bits of hardened steel through the works. It was a mess. Just then, I heard the rumble of Dale's 40-440. He was done with his own beans and was pulling a disc through his corn stubble across the road. He saw my combine sitting dead in the middle of the field, tools scattered around it on the tarp. He throttled down and drove right up to the edge of my field, the big tractor idling with an impatient rumble. He leaned out of his clean, quiet cab. "Trouble, Frank?" he called out, a little too cheerfully. "Through a bearing," I said, wiping a streak of black grease from my forehead with the back of my hand. He shook his head slowly. That "I told you so" look firmly in place. "Damn, Frank, that's a tough break, right in the middle of harvest." He paused, letting the weight of my predicament hang in the air. "Look, I feel for you. Tell you what, I can come over tomorrow morning with my 7720 and knock this out for you in about 4 hours. Just charge you my standard custom rate." His 7720 was a monster, a brand new combine he'd bought that summer. His custom rate, as I knew from the talk at the co-op, was $100 an acre. 4 hours of work, $5,000. That was more than my entire profit on that field. It was a lifeline, but it was wrapped in the chains of dependency I'd spent my whole life avoiding. "That's a kind offer, Dale," I said, my voice tight, "but I think I can handle it." He actually laughed. "Handle it? Frank, the parts store is closed. Even if you could find a bearing for that old relic, it'll take you 2 days to get it put back together. The rain's coming. You're going to lose the whole crop." "I'll take my chances," I said, turning back to the broken machine. "Suit yourself," he shrugged, revving his engine. "Don't come crying to me when your beans are rotting in the mud." He put the 440 in gear and drove off, leaving me alone in the dusty twilight with the carcass of my combine. For a moment, I felt a wave of despair. He was right. The odds were stacked against me. The easy thing to do would be to swallow my pride and pay him. But then I thought of my father and the lessons he'd hammered into me. "Never let another man have that kind of power over you, son," he'd say. "The minute you depend on his machine, you're working for him, not for yourself." A new resolve hardened in my gut. I wasn't beaten yet. I drove my pickup truck back to the workshop, a single bare bulb casting long shadows over the organized chaos of my tools. I didn't have a new bearing, but I had something else. In a dusty wooden box on a high shelf was a collection of old parts my father had saved from a gleaner he'd scrapped 20 years ago. We never threw anything away that might have a second life in it. I rummaged through greasy gears and worn-out sprockets until my fingers closed around it. A main bearing housing, caked in dried grease but solid. I spent the next hour cleaning it with a wire brush and solvent until the steel shone under the light. The bearing itself was old, but it felt smooth. It would hold. I worked through the night under the cold, bright glare of the harvest moon. I used a block of oak and a 10-pound sledgehammer to carefully tap the old housing out and the new one in. I packed the bearing with fresh grease until it oozed from the seals. Every muscle in my back and shoulders screamed in protest. By 3 a.m., I had it all back together. I was covered in grease from head to toe, so tired I could barely stand, but it was done. I climbed into the cab, turned the key, and said a silent prayer. The engine turned over, and I slowly engaged the separator. There was no groan, no whine, just the steady, powerful hum of a machine ready to work. I cut beans as the sun came up, a red ball on the horizon. I finished the last row just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, streaking the dust on my windshield. As I drove the old gleaner back to the shed, I passed Dale's farm. His shiny new 7720 combine was parked neatly by his barn, clean and ready for a harvest that was already over. My victory was private, silent, and deeply satisfying. I hadn't just saved my crop, I had proven to myself that the old way, the hard way, was still a viable path. I had stared into the face of a $5,000 bill and beaten it back with a 50-year-old piece of scrap steel and a long night of sweat. The next couple of years felt like Dale had been right all along. The late 1970s were a boom time for American agriculture like no one had ever seen. The Russians were buying wheat, the price of corn hit $3 a bushel and stayed there, and farmland values were doubling every few years. The banks, flush with cash from foreign oil deposits, were practically begging farmers to take out loans. The mantra from the universities and the Department of Agriculture was simple: get big or get out. Expansion was the name of the game, and debt was the fuel. Dale Peterson played that game better than anyone in our township. The year after he bought his 4440, he used the rising value of his land as collateral to buy the 160 acres that bordered my property to the north when Old Man Hemmings finally retired. He didn't even blink at the price, which was twice what it would have been 5 years earlier. To work the new ground, he added another tractor to his fleet, a massive John Deere 8640 articulated four-wheel drive. It was a beast of a machine, with 8 huge tires and an engine that you could hear from 2 miles away. He bought a new, bigger planter to go with it, and traded his year-old 7720 combine for the new 7720 turbo model, because it had 10 more horsepower and a slightly larger grain tank. His farmstead began to look less like a family farm and more like a dealership lot. Everything was new, everything was green, everything was financed. Dale and his wife, Sarah, built a new ranch-style house set back from the road, with a big picture window and a 2-car garage. They traded their Ford station wagon for a brand new Lincoln Town car. They took a vacation to Hawaii that winter. At the co-op, Dale was treated like a prophet. The younger farmers hung on his every word, asking for advice on negotiating with the bank and which options to get on their new equipment. He was the poster child for the modern, aggressive farmer. Meanwhile, I just kept doing what I'd always done. The good prices meant I was making more money than ever before, but my reaction was different from Dale's. Instead of seeing the boom as an opportunity to expand, I saw it as a chance to armor plate my operation. The first thing I did was pay off the farm completely. The mortgage had been small, a lingering note from when my father had added a new barn in the 60s, but I wanted it gone. I'll never forget the day I walked into the bank and handed the teller the final payment. The bank manager, a young guy named Thompson, who was Dale's best friend, looked at me like I had 2 heads. "Frank," he said, shaking his head as he stamped the paperwork. "You know, with your equity, you could borrow $500,000 right now. Buy out the Miller place to your south. You could be running 1,000 acres. "And what would I have then?" I asked. "You'd have 1,000 acres," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "No," I replied, folding the paid-in-full receipt and putting it in my shirt pocket. "I'd have a $500,000 debt. Right now, I have 320 acres, and they're all mine. I like that feeling better." He just smiled a condescending smile and went back to approving another loan for one of Dale's friends. I used the extra income to prepare for the lean years I knew had to be coming. I didn't buy new machines, but I rebuilt the ones I had. I pulled the diesel engine on the 1086 again, not because it was broken, but because I wanted it to be perfect. I had the crankshaft turned, put in new sleeves, pistons and bearings. I had the injection pump and injectors professionally rebuilt. When I was done, she ran better than she had the day she rolled out of the factory in Rock Island. I replaced the worn-out augers on the gleaner, put new tires on the grain truck. I bought a used Lincoln arc welder and taught myself how to repair cracked frames and broken hitches. My farm was a fortress of old, reliable, and perfectly maintained iron. To my neighbors, I looked like a man standing still, or worse, going backward. My wife, Martha, bless her heart, tried to be supportive, but I could see the questions in her eyes. When Sarah Peterson would show off her new kitchen or talk about their vacation plans, Martha would just smile and nod, but I knew it stung. "Frank, are we missing out?" she asked me one night as we sat on the porch swing, listening to the crickets. "Everyone else is getting ahead. The Petersons, the Schmidts. They're all buying land. We're just... Here." I took her hand. It was soft but strong, the hand of a woman who had gardened, canned, and raised 2 children on this farm. "Martha," I said softly, "I remember my dad in the 50s, during the soil bank years. Times were tough. He saw neighbors lose everything because they'd borrowed too much during the good years after the war. He told me, 'Son, don't ever bet the farm on the weather or the government. They're both fickle friends.' Right now, everyone thinks this party will last forever. But it won't. And when the music stops, I don't want to be the one left without a chair." She squeezed my hand and leaned her head on my shoulder, but I wasn't sure if she was convinced. It was hard to preach discipline in the middle of a gold rush. The first hint of the coming storm came not in the fields, but on the radio. It was the fall of 1980. I was in my shop, grinding a valve seat for the Farmall M's engine, when the noon farm report came on. The announcer's voice was grim. He was talking about the Federal Reserve and a man named Paul Volcker. To fight runaway inflation, they were raising interest rates. The prime rate, the rate banks charge their best customers, had just hit 15%. A week later, it was 18. By Christmas, it was a staggering 21.5%. To me, it was just a news story. I didn't have any major loans, just my seasonal operating note for seed and fertilizer, which I always paid off at harvest. But for men like Dale Peterson, it was a declaration of war. His entire empire, the new house, the new land, the fleet of green machines, was built on variable rate loans. His payments were tied directly to that prime rate. I was at the co-op a few days later, picking up a bag of salt blocks, when Dale came in. He looked different. The easy swagger was gone. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his face was pale. He was arguing with the manager in a hushed, frantic voice. I only caught a few words. "Extension? Can't possibly. Next quarter." He saw me and stopped talking, his face hardening. He just nodded curtly and walked out. That evening, I was walking my fence line, checking for breaks. I looked across at Dale's farm. The lights were on in his big new house, and I could see his massive 4-wheel drive tractor parked in the yard, its silhouette dark against the winter sky. For 2 years, I had looked at that machine as a symbol of Dale's success and my own stubborn foolishness. But now, seeing it through the lens of 21% interest, it looked different. It was no longer a tractor. It was an anchor, a $200,000 anchor, chained to my neighbor's neck, and he was standing in a boat in the middle of a hurricane. The good times were over. The music had stopped. The spring of 1981 broke hot and early, with a sky the color of washed-out denim that held no promise of rain. By May, the ground was already cracking. The corn I planted came up thin and pale, the leaves curling in on themselves by midday, as if in prayer for a drink. The old-timers at the feed store stopped talking about crop prices and started telling stories about the Dust Bowl. It was the kind of weather that gets inside a man, a dry, persistent worry that settles in your bones. For me, the drought was a hardship. For Dale Peterson, it was a death sentence. His entire operation was leveraged on the assumption of bumper crops and high prices. With his massive payments, a 10% drop in yield was a problem. A 50% drop was a catastrophe. The stress began to carve new lines into his face. I'd see him out on his 8640, tearing across his fields in a cloud of brown dust, not cultivating, but just driving, as if he could force the crops to grow through sheer horsepower and aggression. One sweltering afternoon in July, I was in my shop replacing the sickle sections on my mower bar, the air thick with the smell of hot steel and grinding sparks. I heard Dale's big four-wheel drive start up across the road, the engine roar, and then abruptly die. A minute later, the same thing. The starter would grind, the big diesel would catch for a second, then silence. I put down my tools and walked to the edge of my lane. Dale was climbing down from the cab, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He threw his cap on the ground and kicked one of the giant tires, a gesture of pure, impotent rage. I walked across the road. "What's she doing, Dale?" He jumped, not having seen me approach. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes bloodshot. "I don't know," he snapped, his voice ragged. "She won't stay running. Some damn electrical problem, I think." I looked up at the tractor. It was a marvel of modern engineering, but the cab was a nest of wires and circuit boards I couldn't begin to understand. There were no simple linkages to trace, no fuel shut-off solenoid you could test with a piece of wire. It was a black box. "Did you check the fuel filters?" I asked, starting with the basics. "Of course I checked the fuel filters," he shouted, then seemed to catch himself. He took a deep breath. "Sorry, Frank. Yeah. They're clean. The service guy from the dealership was out here yesterday. He hooked up his computer to it, said it was a faulty sensor in the injection pump control module, said he'd have to order the part from Moline." "Could be a week." "A week?" He gestured wildly at the parched, dying fields around us. "I've got to get my second application of nitrogen on. What little corn is left out there is starving." "Can't you use the 44,440? I asked. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "The bank put a lien on it last month. I was 30 days late on the payment. They told me if I used it, they'd consider it a violation of the note and come get it. Thompson said it was protecting their asset." He spat the words out like they were poison. "My own damn tractor, and I can't even start it." There we stood, between two farms, two worlds. My 60-year-old Farmall M was in the shed, its simple magneto-ignition ready to fire on the first pull. My 1066, with its purely mechanical fuel system, was parked by the barn, ready to work. They were old, they were slow, but they were mine, and they would run. Dale was surrounded by $250,000 of the most advanced agricultural machinery on the planet, and he was completely helpless, waiting on a computer chip from a factory 1,000 miles away. He finally picked up his cap and beat the dust out of it against his leg. "A week," he muttered again, staring at the silent green giant. "The crop will be burned up by then." He looked at me, and for the first time, the pity in his eyes was gone. In its place, was something I had never expected to see. A flicker of desperate, bewildered envy. He didn't say another word, just turned and walked toward his big empty house, a captain on a sinking ship. I went back to my shop, the sound of my grinder biting into steel seeming impossibly loud in the heavy, silent air. The cracks in Dale's empire were no longer hidden. They were chasms, and the ground was crumbling under his feet. The drought of 81 was followed by a wet, miserable harvest. The corn that had survived the dry summer was stunted, the ears small and poorly filled. Soybean pods were thin, and many just shattered as the combine header hit them. The price, which everyone hoped would spike because of the short crop, collapsed instead. A grain embargo against the Soviet Union had been lifted, but the damage was done. The export market was in shambles, and we were drowning in a surplus of mediocre grain. It was the worst of all possible worlds, low yields and low prices. For farmers across the heartland, the winter of 1982 was a time of reckoning. The phone calls from the bank started, first polite, then demanding. Loan extension meetings turned into grim lectures on asset liquidation. For sale signs began to pop up on land that had been in the same family for 100 years. Every trip to town felt like attending a wake. You'd see a neighbor, a man you'd known your whole life, and you wouldn't know what to say. His eyes would be hollow, his shoulders stooped, with a weight that had nothing to do with physical labor. My farm survived. We weren't prosperous that year, not by a long shot. Martha and I tightened our belts, put off plans to re-shingle the barn roof, and ate a lot from our garden. But we were okay. The bills were paid. The land was still ours. Having no debt was like having a lifeboat in the middle of a typhoon. We were tossed about on the waves, but we weren't going to sink. Dale Peterson had no such lifeboat. His situation went from bad to worse. The bank refused to renew his operating loan for the next spring. They called his notes. I heard he tried to sell the 8640 and the new combine, but the market was flooded with used equipment from other failed farms. He couldn't get half of what he owed on them. The final notice came in the form of a poster stapled to a telephone pole by the end of our lane. It was a stark, black and white flyer. Farm auction, it read in big block letters. By order of Boone County National Bank, the property of Dale and Sarah Peterson. The date was set for the first Saturday in March. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a raw wind whipping across the frozen fields. The entire county, it seemed, had turned out. They weren't there to gloat. They were there to bear witness, to mourn, and maybe to pick through the bones. The farmyard was crammed with pickup trucks. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a big cowboy hat, stood on the back of a flatbed trailer, his voice a relentless, hypnotic chant that echoed off the metal sides of the machine shed. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands jammed in my pockets. Martha had refused to come. "I can't watch that," she'd said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't watch Sarah lose her home." I watched as Dale's life was sold off, piece by piece. The Lincoln Town car went first, for a fraction of its value. Then the household goods, the furniture, the tools from his workshop. I saw Sarah Peterson standing on the porch of her house, her face a pale, frozen mask, watching strangers carry her life away. Then they moved to the machinery. The big 8640, the tractor Dale had been so proud of, was started up one last time. It rumbled, a sad, wounded sound. A young farmer from the next county, his face flush with the thrill of a bargain, got it for a price that made the crowd gasp. It was less than Dale's loan balance on the tractor alone. One by one, the green machines were driven away by new owners. Finally, the auctioneer turned to the land itself. He sold it in parcels. The 160 acres he'd bought from Old Man Hemmings went first. Then, the 80 acres to the east. I just stood and watched, a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. Dale was standing near the barn, his back to the crowd, staring at the fence line that separated his farm from mine. He looked like a statue. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "All right, folks, the last parcel of the day. The home quarter. 160 acres, with the house, the barns, and the grain bins. A fine, productive piece of ground. The homestead of the Peterson family for 3 generations. What am I bid?" A heavy silence fell over the crowd. This was different. This wasn't just land, it was a legacy. No one wanted to be the one to take another man's home. The banker, Thompson, stepped forward, looking nervous. "We'll start the bidding at $1,000 an acre," he said, his voice thin in the wind. The auctioneer started his chant. $1,000 an acre. Now who'll give 1,000? $1,000. Can I get 1,000? Silence. The farmers shuffled their feet, looking at the ground, at the sky, anywhere but at the auctioneer or at Dale. "Come on, folks," the auctioneer pleaded. "This is prime Boone County land." I felt a nudge at my elbow. It was old man Harris. "You gonna let the bank steal it, Frank?" he whispered, his eyes fixed on me. "You're the only one here who can afford it and has the right to own it. You didn't dance with the devil when the music was playing." I looked from Harris to Dale's rigid back, then to the house where his wife was standing. I thought of Dale's smug grin. That day he bought the 40. I thought of his condescending advice, his pitying looks. A part of me, a dark, petty part, wanted to see him pay the price. But that wasn't the way my father had raised me. We were neighbors. We were farmers. Our fortunes were tied to the same sun, the same rain, the same unforgiving soil. I took a deep breath. The cold air burned my lungs. I raised my hand. $1,000, I said. My voice sounded strange, loud in the quiet yard. Every head in the crowd turned to look at me. The auctioneer's face broke into a relieved grin. "I've got 1,000 from Frank Miller. Now who'll give 1,100? A man I didn't know, probably an investor from the city, raised his hand. 1,100. 1,200, I said, my voice firmer this time. The investor went to 13. 1,500, I said, cutting him off. I wanted this to be over. The investor hesitated, did some quick math in his head, and shook his head no. The auctioneer pointed his gavel at me. "Sold! To Frank Miller for $1,500 an acre!" He slammed the gavel down. The sound cracked through the cold air like a rifle shot. It was over. A low murmur went through the crowd, and then people began to drift away, heading back to their trucks, their faces grim. The show was done. I walked over to the trailer to sign the papers. As I was finishing, Dale approached. His face was ashen, his eyes hollowed out. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. He stopped a few feet away from me, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "You," he said, his voice a choked whisper. "Of all people. You came here to gloat, to pick my bones clean." I finished signing my name and handed the pen back to the clerk. I turned to face him squarely. "No, Dale," I said, my voice low and steady. "I didn't come here to gloat. I came here to stop the bank from owning your father's house." He stared at me, his mind struggling to process what I'd said. Confusion warred with anger on his face. "I don't understand," he stammered. "Look," I said, stepping closer. "This whole thing is a damn tragedy. You got caught in a trap. A lot of good men did. But your grandfather built that barn. Your father was born in that house. It shouldn't belong to a bunch of suits in a boardroom." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my checkbook. I wrote a check to the bank for the full amount, my hand steady. Then I turned to Dale. "Here's the deal," I said. "You and Sarah are going to stay in that house. You're going to farm that quarter section. You're going to pay me fair cash rent, the same as any other tenant. And when you get back on your feet, if you still want it, you can buy it back from me for exactly what I paid for it today. Not a penny more." He just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He looked from my face to the check in my hand, then back again. His hard, angry expression began to crumble. His shoulders shook, and a sound, a raw, ragged sob, tore from his throat. He turned away, hiding his face, but I could see the tears tracing clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He didn't say thank you. He couldn't. But in that moment, the fence between our farms, the one that had stood as a symbol of our different philosophies for so long, simply vanished. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Dale became my tenant, and in a strange way, my partner. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce determination. He worked harder than I'd ever seen him work. He used my old 1066 to plant the corn on his old home place, and I taught him how to set the 6-row planter, how to listen to the engine, how to feel the machine through the seat of his pants. He was a quick learner. He had been a good farmer all along. He had just been a terrible banker. The community changed, too. The talk at the co-op was different. The flashy, high-leverage operators were gone. The men left standing were guys like me, quiet, conservative farmers who had weathered the storm by staying small, staying out of debt, and knowing their iron inside and out. My reputation shifted from the stubborn old fool to something else. Younger farmers started stopping by my shop, not to talk about interest rates, but to ask how to rebuild a carburetor or weld a cracked axle. I never preached. I just showed them what my father had shown me, how to be self-reliant. Years passed. The 1980s gave way to the 90s. My son, Tom, came back to the farm after college. He had my hands, but his mother's patient eyes. I started teaching him, just as my father had taught me. One afternoon, we were in the shop, working on the old Farmall M. She needed a new clutch, and I was showing him how to split the tractor in two, right behind the engine block. It was a job I could do in my sleep. Dale stopped by. He was driving an older but well-kept pickup truck. He had managed to save enough to buy back the home quarter 5 years after the auction, just as I had promised. He and Sarah were still in the house, and he was farming his 160 acres and renting another 80 from a neighbor. He was happy. Not rich, but happy. He watched Tom and me work for a few minutes, a small smile on his face. "You know, Frank," he said, "I used to laugh at you for keeping this old thing around." He reached out and laid a hand on the M's faded red hood. "Now I get it. That tractor doesn't represent the past. It represents control. You control it. It doesn't control you." I nodded, wiping a smear of grease from my knuckle. "That's about the size of it." He looked at my son, Tom. "You listen to your dad," he said, his voice earnest. "There's more wisdom in that one greasy fingerprint on his forehead than in a whole room full of bankers." He gave a nod, got back in his truck, and drove off down the lane. Tom looked at me after he was gone. "He told me the whole story once, Dad, about the auction, about what you did." "It was the right thing to do," I said gruffly, not wanting to make a big deal of it. "Now grab that 3/4-inch wrench. We need to block this front end up before we pull it apart." Later that evening, long after the work was done, I sat on the porch swing, the same one where Martha and I had sat so many years before. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across my fields. The corn was tall and green, the tassels just starting to show. It was my land, every square inch of it, paid for with sweat and patience. I could hear the distant, familiar sound of Dale's old International tractor as he finished cultivating his beans. It was a good sound. Tom came out and sat beside me. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fireflies begin to dance over the lawn. "Dad," he said finally, "that day at the auction, were you scared?" I thought about it for a long time, remembering the cold wind, the grim faces, the weight of the decision. "No," I said, my voice quiet but sure. I wasn't scared. I was sad for Dale. But I wasn't scared for me. Because I knew, no matter what happened, no one was going to come and take my home. Your grandfather taught me that the most valuable thing you can harvest isn't corn or beans. It's independence. It doesn't show up on a balance sheet, and you can't use it as collateral at the bank. But when the storms come, it's the only crop that matters. I looked out over the land, my land, stretching out in the fading light. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and growing things. In the distance, I heard the pop, pop, pop of an old tractor starting up. It was a sound as steady as my own heartbeat, the sound of a lesson learned, a legacy secured, a quiet and hard-won peace